An incredibly useful control in our toolbox is a timer. And timers get used a lot once we start developing really interesting and intricate programs such as games. But we can keep them simple, and they definitely have their uses for simple applications. So how does a timer work? Well, when you double click to add a timer to your program, it's not something the user will see on the program. It kind of works behind the scenes. So let's talk about a few properties here. So first of all, a good prefix for a timer is TMR. And what the timer does is if you double click it, every time the timer ticks, any code you write in here will execute. So when does the timer tick? Well, let's take a look here. Your timer has an interval property. By default, it's set to 100. Now this is measured in milliseconds. So it'll take 0.1 second for this timer to tick. Similarly, you could set this to 1,000, and this will take the timer 1 second to tick. So every 1 second that timer will tick, and that code will fire off. Let's give ourselves some breathing room and set it to 3,000. So that timer will tick every 3 seconds. So by default, the timer is not enabled when you add it to your program, which means when you run the program, the timer is not ticking at all. You can set this to be true so that when you do run the program, the timer will tick. The timer will start ticking as soon as the program launches. So I have a label on my form that has no text in it. So when this timer ticks, let's put some text in my label. The timer has ticked. So because my timer is enabled as soon as I launch the program, that means the timer is on, and in 3 seconds it'll tick and any code will execute. And the only code I have is changing the text of that label. Now that's perfect and pretty clear, but just be careful because that timer will keep ticking every 3 seconds. So maybe you just want the timer to tick once, and that means I have to turn the timer off once I'm done with it. So once the timer has ticked once, I don't want it to keep ticking, so I'm going to disable it. Now, just one last thing. The timer was enabled by default. We set it to be true. We could set it to false, and when I run the program, the timer is not on, right? The timer is disabled. So you might kind of have a chain reaction here where you might have, let's say, a button, and let's say when I click the button, I want the timer to turn on. In other words, I want to enable the timer. So the timer is disabled by default. However, when I click the button, the timer will turn on. And now that the timer is on, it's going to tick 3 seconds later. And once it ticks, I will see this line of codes happen. And of course, the timer turns itself off. So it's really cool because you can kind of get this intricate kind of chain reaction with timers. So the timer in this case, it's not on until I press the button. So I'm going to click the button, and in 3 seconds that timer will tick. Once 3 seconds has passed, the code happens, I see text in the label, and the timer has now turned itself off. So it is now disabled.